ever wondered what happens to a person who has been there for everyone all their life until they finally fall silent? Not because they stopped loving, but because something within them finally stopped making sense. Some people aren't destroyed by a sudden outburst. They're destroyed by silent, daily resignation. And then, something awakens. Carl Jung called this shadow integration. Existentialists would call it the moment when the soul rejects the role it has been playing and finally chooses itself. In every group, there's someone who always picks up the phone. Someone who doesn't say no. Someone who knows the emotions of others better than their own. Such a person is often not just a friend. They're an unofficial therapist. A soul saver. A voice of reason in chaos. But how often is this role a choice? And how often is it a survival mechanism? The world loves empathetic people, but it doesn't really love them. It loves their function. As long as they give. As long as they don't ask. As long as they're convenient. There's a moment no one notices. Except the person themselves. The moment when you pick up the phone and feel nothing. No impulse to save. No desire to be that person again. This isn't burnout. This is awakening. It's the moment when the soul says enough of playing this role. It doesn't mean you stop loving. It means you start loving yourself. Once you were silent out of care, now you're silent from a boundary. Adam was 35. He was a teacher, a listener, a mediator. His home was a haven for friends, family, co-workers. But no one knew about his insomnia. No one saw how in the evenings he'd lie in bed with his eyes closed and 1,000 foreign emotions in his head. His empathy was armor. His smile, a mask, and his heart, transformed into a container for other people's pain. One day during a family dinner, his sister told the same story again. One he knew by heart, another toxic relationship, another request for understanding, another emotional investment with no return. And then something strange happened. Adam said nothing. He didn't try to help. He didn't lean in. He just stared into the void and felt something he had never known before, inner silence. This wasn't indifference. It was a boundary. It wasn't a loss of heart. It was its protection. Carl Jung wrote about the persona, the mask we wear to be accepted. For years, Adam wore the mask of the eternally strong, available, patient person. But that mask started to crack. In the shadow of that persona lay his true strength, the ability to say no, to recognize that not every crisis was his duty, that love without reciprocity isn't a virtue, but an addiction. Existentialists, like Kierkegaard and Sartre, spoke of authenticity, a state where a person stops being defined by others and begins choosing themselves. But this choice always carries loneliness. For years, Adam was needed. And now, he was no longer available, not because he didn't love, but because he wanted to live. This is a different kind of loneliness. Not the one that hurts, the one that heals. His family began saying, "You've changed." Friends felt ignored. They didn't understand that Adam's absence wasn't revenge. It was a boundary. From the perspective of those who used his availability, every no was a blow, but from his perspective, every no was healing. He wasn't rejecting others, he was finally accepting himself. Empathy, without boundaries, is the suicide of the soul. Self-awareness isn't selfishness. It's a philosophical act of courage. Adam stopped being the therapist no one asked for permission. He stopped being the filter for other people's emotions. He became a person who paradoxically loves deeper, because he loves wiser. Jung wrote, "We won't achieve enlightenment by imagining light, but by becoming aware of our own shadow." Adam finally embraced that shadow and became whole. You're not insensitive, you're aware. You're not selfish, you're whole. People will say you've changed, but you didn't change. You stopped hiding. And that's the difference. Because when an empathetic person stops being available, they don't become a monster. They become someone who finally lives. And that's when you become dangerous, not to people, but to the system that fed off your silence. But what happens when an empathetic individual, the one who always gave everything of themselves, the one who could feel the vibrations of emotions in the room before anyone spoke, suddenly stops trying? Not dramatically, not through anger, but quietly, deeply, and definitively. This isn't a rebellion. It's not an act of vengeance. It's an act of transparency. Because the empath who leaves doesn't leave suddenly. They've long since stopped being present. They left piece by piece, listening to empty promises, justifying wounds as accidents, learning that their needs are a luxury, not a right. Until one day, without shouting, without tears, silence falls. And then change comes, not in the external world, because that will still demand, expect and demand. The change happens inside. The one who was always emotionally available becomes unavailable, not because they stopped loving, but because they learned to love themselves. It's a paradox. For their entire life, the empath thought their worth was based on how much they could give others. But when they begin to understand that their presence was a luxury, not a duty, everything changes. They stop answering messages that used to move them. They stop saving those who are drowning while they themselves can barely breathe. They stop apologizing. They stop giving access to their soul to those who only saw it as useful. And here their strength is born, quiet, but undeniable. Because the empath who stopped sacrificing doesn't become cold, they become transparent. They don't hide behind a smile, they don't say it's fine when it isn't. They stop being a mirror for other people's emotions and begin being themselves. This isn't selfish, this is responsibility for oneself. Empaths don't have to be saviors. Their role isn't to carry the world on their shoulders until their own knees collapse. Their role is to live in truth. And the truth is this: not everyone deserves your emotional availability. Not everyone deserves to carry your light if they won't even light a candle themselves. Sometimes the greatest act of love for yourself is to leave without a word. Not from a lack of feelings, but from an abundance of wounds. Because the empathetic soul does not leave because it is weak. It leaves when it has understood everything. When it sees the mechanisms that sentiment had once masked. When it realizes that its presence was not only ignored, but sometimes exploited. And it no longer wants to fight for space in someone else's chaos. It no longer wants to be understood. It wants to be respected. This is when true transformation begins. The empath becomes sovereign. Instead of entering relationships that resemble a battlefield, it begins to choose relationships that are like a temple. Quiet, safe, mutual. Instead of explaining why something hurts, it simply leaves places that cause pain. Instead of trying to be everything to everyone, it allows itself to be everything to itself. This is not easy, because the empath is used to feeling for others, thinking for others, breathing for two. But at some point it learns that its life does not belong to others, that its time is not currency to be thrown around carelessly. It starts protecting its energy like fire, which only warms those who do not extinguish it. And no, this does not mean becoming indifferent. It means that it has finally matured emotionally, because maturity is not about how much we can endure. It is about how much we are willing not to tolerate. The empath who has awakened is someone who no longer carries the dirt of others, simply because they can. It is someone who says, I understand how you feel, but I am not responsible for making you stop feeling bad. Only you can do that. This is not indifference. This is respect for oneself and for others. But here's the paradox. When the empath finally stops sacrificing themselves, the world does not reward them. The world steps back, because for many they were valuable only when they gave. When they stop giving, they become difficult, cold, different. Those who have drawn from their light for years now turn away because they don't know what to do with their shadow. And the empath's shadow is something no one expects. It is not aggression. It is not aggression. It is silence. It is the silence of someone who will no longer explain, will no longer justify, will no longer ask, because they have realized they don't need to. An awakened empath does not become a monster. They become whole, someone who no longer represses their anger, pain, frustration, who no longer pretends that everything is fine when there is a fire burning inside. They start saying no although they had said yes for years. They start leaving situations that suffocate them. Instead of sacrificing themselves in them, they begin choosing themselves, not out of selfishness, but out of deep understanding that without themselves, they have nothing to give others. This awakening hurts, because suddenly, one has to see how much of their own value was given away to others. How many times they allowed someone to disrespect them because they feared conflict. How many times they pretended something didn't hurt to avoid burdening others. And how much, in this silent sacrifice game, they lost their own identity. But it is also an awakening to freedom, to a new kind of love, that which does not require denying oneself, to relationships that are not based on one-sided giving, but on mutuality. To a life in which empathy is not a prison, but a gift consciously offered, not coerced. And most importantly, to meeting oneself, not that idealistic version the world expected, but the true self, with emotions that had been suppressed, with anger that had been screaming behind the smile, with the desire to be seen, not just as the good one, but as a person full of contradictions, wounds, strength, and tenderness. Because true empathy begins only when we can turn it inward, when we embrace ourselves with the same tenderness we have given to others for years. When the empath stops sacrificing themselves, they stop being afraid, and then they become free. But before the empath becomes truly dangerous, they must go through one more, most painful stage, the confrontation with their own shadow. Because here comes the moment when they begin to ask themselves the questions they had feared before. Why am I so afraid of being selfish? Why do I always have to be available? Why do I keep justifying those who hurt me? And then the truth dawns on them. It was never about others. It was about themselves, about identifying their worth with being needed. That the love they offered was often rooted in a fear of rejection, not in freedom. This does not mean their feelings were false. It means they were one-sided. That for years they gave themselves away on the altar of relationships that were never symmetrical. But when they begin to understand that they can love without sacrificing themselves, their view changes. It becomes penetrating. They observe without judging. They listen, but no longer in silence. And when they say no, it is not a cry of despair. It is a declaration of existence. This is when the empath becomes someone who can walk out of the room they once begged to stay in. This is when they stop writing long messages, explaining that they had no bad intention. This is when they don't pick up the phone from someone who once could ruin their entire day with a single sentence. And no, not because they stopped loving, but because they finally started loving themselves more. This collision with the shadow is inevitable, because the shadow is not evil. It is simply what has been suppressed. In the empath, it is anger that was never expressed, the anger that was turned into understanding, the sadness worn like a badge of loyalty. It all returns, but no longer as an enemy. It returns as a guide, because only when the empath accepts that they can also be disappointed, tired, frustrated, can they start living in truth, not just in the role of caretaker. And suddenly something magical happens. They stop fearing conflict. They stop fearing loneliness. They stop fearing that someone will not understand them, because they finally understand themselves. And the world begins to sense this. It no longer attracts those who seek emotional suppliers. Instead, those appear who say, "You don't need to save me. Just being here is enough." It is a completely different quality of relationship, not based on dependence, but on mutual respect, not built on pity, but on balance. Because when the empath wakes up from the illusion, they become not only free, they become strong. Not the kind of strength that hurts, but the kind that no longer allows itself to be hurt for no reason. And maybe that's why people say, the empath who stopped sacrificing themselves is unrecognizable, because they can no longer enter their soul as they once did, because their tears are no longer an invitation for manipulation, but a testimony of truth, because their presence no longer says use me but respect me or leave. That's when they become dangerous. Not because they hurt, but because they will never allow themselves to be hurt again in the name of someone else's needs. But here comes the most important point of this transformation. When the empath stops being afraid of being rejected, they become unbreakable. Because for their whole life, they had been held hostage by fear. Fear that if they said no, they would be alone. That if they expressed their anger, people would leave them. That if they stopped being useful, they would stop being loved. But now, they don't care. Not because they don't feel, but because they finally feel themselves more than everyone around them. They begin to see that true love doesn't require self-destruction, that relationships based on how much you give of yourself are not love. They are emotional trading, often unfair, and that those who truly deserve their presence won't require them to constantly sacrifice themselves. This awakening changes their identity. They are no longer just the sensitive one. They are no longer the good person. They become a whole person, a person who can love and at the same time walk away, a person who gives but does not allow themselves to be exploited, a person who knows how to say, "I'm not here to save you at the cost of myself." And that's when their environment begins to panic, because those who had gotten used to their silence are surprised by their voice. Those who had gotten used to their agreement are confused by their boundaries. In this new chapter of life, the empath is no longer a victim. They are a strategy. They still feel, but they no longer get sucked into every drama. They still understand other people's emotions, but they no longer take them as their own. They still empathize, But they don't allow empathy to become a tool of manipulation, because now they know that sometimes the greatest expression of love is distance, not for punishment, but for the protection of their own spirit. That saying enough is not an act of violence, but an act of mercy toward themselves. What the world sees as change is, for them, a return to themselves, to their true identity, which somewhere along the way they had abandoned in the name of being liked, needed, accepted. But they no longer have to, because they've understood that being true is more important than being nice. And now, instead of asking, "What can I do to be loved?" they ask another question: is what I'm getting worth what I'm giving? Because their love is no longer an unlimited resource for everyone. It is a gift that they now give consciously, with full power, or not at all. And this is where their dangerous strength lies. They have learned to love themselves as much as they once loved others. It's not that empathy has died, it's the illusion that it must be constantly torn to be real. Because when the empath stops being an emotional hostage to others, they don't become cold, they become free. This path of awakening is neither easy nor quick. It's a process that requires courage, patience, and constant struggle with internal contradiction. It's like climbing a mountain, the summit of which is hidden in the mist. You only see the next step, not the end of the journey. On this path, the empath must learn to set boundaries. Boundaries that to many seem cold, but in reality are an expression of the highest care for oneself. In a world that rewards being available and self-sacrificing, boundaries are often seen as weakness or selfishness. But the truth is the opposite. Boundaries are strength. Boundaries say to the world, "I'm not your savior nor your leftover. I am myself, whole, with clear needs and the right to protect them." It is through this protection that the empath can start truly living, instead of existing in a perpetual state of readiness to save others. All of this is deeply rooted in Jungian psychology. Carl Jung spoke about the need to integrate the shadow, those parts of ourselves that we suppress because they seem too painful, bad, or unacceptable. For the empath, the shadow is not only anger but also the desire to be heard and respected, without the need for constant give. Integrating the shadow is meeting oneself without judgment, allowing oneself to feel the full spectrum of emotions, even the difficult ones, and accepting them as part of one's truth. When the empath goes through this process, they stop living in a split between what they should do and what they really feel. They stop being the good boy or good girl for the world. They start being themselves. And that is true freedom. But what about those who are still stuck in old patterns? Those who fear rejection, conflict, and loneliness? For them, this transformation may seem terrifying, because it requires letting go of the illusion that sacrifice is the only way to love. It requires facing the truth, often painful, that not everyone deserves their energy. But it also promises something more than ever: a life in authenticity, in deep connection with oneself and with others who can respect them. This is the journey from being the eternal giver to being whole. So now, I ask you, how much more can you give before you start giving to yourself? How many more times will you let your sensitivity be read as weakness before you recognize it as your greatest strength? Are you ready to stop being invisible to yourself? To start saying no without guilt? To protect your energy the way you protect what's most precious to you? Because remember, the greatest freedom is found when we stop agreeing to live against ourselves. The empath's awakening is not the end of the journey, it's the beginning of a new one. A journey full of respect, courage, and true love, that for oneself. And though the world may not understand you, though those close to you may read this transformation as coldness or turning away, you know the truth, because you are finally yourself.